The day Naomi Carter walked out of prison was the day a billionaire's empire quietly began to collapse. 5 years earlier, the world had believed she was a criminal, a woman who had betrayed the powerful man she married. But the truth had never needed permission to survive. It only needed time. On a cold gray morning in upstate New York, the iron gates of Bedford Hills Correctional Facility slid open with a slow mechanical hum, and Naomi Carter stepped forward into the pale sunlight, like someone emerging from another lifetime. She paused for only a moment, breathing in the crisp October air, the first breath of freedom she had tasted in exactly 5 years, 3 months, and 12 days. The world outside looked strangely calm, almost indifferent to the storm that had once destroyed her life. Naomi adjusted the simple charcoal coat she had been given upon release, its fabric light against shoulders that had once carried designer gowns in Manhattan penthouses. She looked different now, not broken, refined, sharpened. 5 years had carved away everything unnecessary and left only something stronger behind. Beyond the security gate, a black Rolls-Royce Phantom waited quietly beside the curb, its polished body reflecting the pale sky. A tall man leaned against the driver's side door, hands tucked in the pockets of a navy overcoat. Daniel Brooks had aged a little since the last time she saw him, but his steady presence was exactly the same. He gave a small nod when their eyes met, the silent kind of greeting reserved for people who had survived difficult truths together. Naomi walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate, as if reclaiming the ground beneath her feet. "Good morning, Naomi," Daniel said gently as he opened the rear door for her. She glanced at the car, then back at him with a faint, controlled smile. "5 years ago," she said quietly, "I left Manhattan in the back of a police vehicle. It seems fitting that I return in something a little different." Daniel allowed himself a small laugh before closing the door behind her. The engine purred to life, smooth and powerful, and the car rolled away from the prison gates without ceremony. Naomi leaned back against the leather seat and watched the tall fence fade into the distance through the tinted window. For years the world had believed a simple story. Naomi Carter, the wife of billionaire CEO Ethan Whitmore, had been convicted of corporate fraud after millions disappeared from Whitmore Global's accounts. Headlines had called it betrayal, financial crime, a scandal that shook Manhattan's elite. The trial had been swift, the verdict even swifter. What the world never questioned was the man sitting in the courtroom's front row, the man whose testimony sealed her fate. Ethan Whitmore, her husband, the man who once promised she was the greatest decision of his life. Daniel guided the car onto the highway as the quiet countryside blurred past. "Manhattan hasn't changed much," he said after a moment. "But Ethan Whitmore's world certainly has." Naomi turned her gaze forward, calm and unreadable. 5 years ago she had entered prison with nothing but silence and a single promise to herself. She would survive. She would learn. And one day she would return. Not with anger. Not with revenge. With truth. Her reflection stared back at her in the window glass, steady and composed. A woman far stronger than the one the courtroom had condemned. Daniel glanced at her through the mirror. "Are you ready?" he asked. Naomi Carter folded her hands gently in her lap as the skyline of Manhattan began to appear on the horizon, its steel towers rising like silent witnesses. Her voice was quiet, but there was something unshakable inside it. "I've been ready for 5 years." The highway carried them steadily south as the early autumn sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long silver reflections across the windshield of the Rolls-Royce. Naomi Carter sat quietly in the back seat, her posture calm, her gaze fixed on the distant skyline of Manhattan slowly rising beyond the horizon. 5 years earlier she had left that city surrounded by flashing cameras, reporters shouting accusations, and the cold certainty that her life had ended. Today there were no reporters waiting, no cameras watching, only silence and the steady rhythm of the road beneath the tires. Daniel Brooks drove with the relaxed precision of a man who had spent his life navigating complicated paths. For several miles neither of them spoke. Some silences did not need to be filled. Naomi studied the familiar shape of the city ahead, remembering a different time when Manhattan had once belonged to her. There had been a penthouse overlooking Central Park where morning light spilled through 40-foot glass windows, where fresh flowers arrived every Monday from a florist on Madison Avenue. where the scent of Ethiopian coffee drifted through quiet hallways while the city woke below them. In those days, Naomi Carter had not been known as a criminal. She had been known as Naomi Whitmore, the brilliant corporate attorney who helped build Whitmore Global from a promising company into one of the most powerful investment firms on the East Coast. Ethan Whitmore had always told people she was the sharpest mind in the room. At charity galas, he would place a hand gently at the small of her back and say with a proud smile that he would never have built his empire without her. At the time, Naomi believed him. She believed in the quiet strength of partnership, in long nights reviewing contracts together at the kitchen island, in weekend mornings walking through Central Park while Ethan planned his next acquisition, and she offered the careful legal strategy that made it possible. Their story had once been admired across Manhattan. A self-made billionaire and the lawyer who matched him step for step. The newspapers called them a power couple. Investors called them unstoppable. Daniel's voice finally broke the quiet as traffic began to thicken near the George Washington Bridge. "Ethan Whitmore is speaking tonight," he said calmly. Naomi did not move. "Where?" she asked. "The Whitmore Global Annual Gala," Daniel replied. "The Plaza Hotel. 7 o'clock this evening. The entire financial world will be there." Naomi watched a silver airplane drift slowly across the blue sky above the Hudson River. 5 years ago, she would have been standing beside Ethan on that stage, greeting donors and investors while a string quartet played softly near the ballroom ceiling. "Does he know I am out?" she asked. Daniel allowed a faint smile. "Not yet." Naomi rested her head gently against the leather seat as Manhattan drew closer, the tall glass towers rising like familiar ghosts from another life. For 5 years, the world had believed a simple version of the story. That Naomi Carter had betrayed Whitmore Global. That she had stolen millions of dollars and hidden it through complicated financial channels. That Ethan Whitmore had bravely exposed the truth even when it meant sending his own wife to prison. It had been a story that made perfect headlines. The tragic fall of a powerful woman. The principled billionaire forced to choose integrity over love. What the headlines never questioned was how quickly the evidence had appeared, or why the one woman who benefited from Naomi's disappearance rose through the company ranks almost overnight. Vanessa Hale, the elegant executive assistant who suddenly became Whitmore Global's new chief operations director just weeks after Naomi's conviction. Daniel guided the car through midtown traffic as the morning sun reflected across towering glass buildings. "Everything is ready," he said quietly. Naomi looked out at the city she once ruled beside her husband. Her voice carried no anger, only certainty. "Good," she replied. "Because tonight Manhattan finally hears the truth." By the time the Rolls-Royce crossed into Manhattan, the city had fully awakened, its avenues alive with yellow taxis, early morning commuters, and the restless rhythm that never truly slept. Naomi Carter watched the familiar skyline glide past the window with quiet composure. But inside her mind, memories began unfolding like pages of a life she once lived. 5 years ago, mornings in Manhattan had started very differently. Sunlight would spill through the towering glass walls of the Whitmore penthouse overlooking Central Park, painting the marble floors in soft gold while the city slowly stirred beneath them. Naomi had loved those mornings. She would wake before Ethan, slip quietly into the kitchen, and review the day's legal reports while the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Back then, Whitmore Global had been growing faster than any financial firm in New York. Investors trusted Ethan Whitmore's instincts, and they trusted Naomi Carter's legal precision even more. She was the architect behind the company's most complex deals, the strategist who made impossible acquisitions legally flawless. Ethan often joked that he was the face of the empire, but Naomi was its backbone. At charity dinners, he would lift a glass and tell guests that marrying Naomi Carter had been the smartest investment of his life. For years, Naomi believed that partnership was real. Until the day Vanessa Hale walked into Whitmore Global. Naomi still remembered that afternoon with remarkable clarity. It had been a warm spring day in April, the kind that filled Central Park with families and sunlight. Vanessa arrived as a new executive assistant recommended by a prestigious recruiting agency. She was poised, polished, and remarkably attentive to Ethan's schedule. At first, Naomi saw nothing unusual. Whitmore Global employed hundreds of professionals, and executive assistants changed frequently as the company expanded. Vanessa worked efficiently, spoke carefully, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly how to succeed in powerful rooms. Months passed before Naomi noticed the first small shifts. Ethan began staying later at the office even when there were no major negotiations scheduled. His phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, rarely left his hand. Conversations that once filled their evenings became shorter, more distracted. Naomi had built her career by recognizing patterns in complicated legal structures, and eventually she noticed the pattern inside her own marriage. Late one evening, she remained at the office reviewing a merger contract long after most employees had gone home. The glass walls of the executive floor reflected the city lights, like distant constellations. As she walked past Ethan's private office, she noticed the door slightly open. Inside, Ethan sat across from Vanessa at the conference table. There was nothing improper about the scene itself. They were discussing documents and financial projections. Yet something about the atmosphere felt different. Too comfortable. Too private. Vanessa leaned forward as she spoke, her voice low and confident. Ethan listened with a focus Naomi had not seen in months. When Ethan noticed Naomi standing in the doorway, he quickly stood up, offering a polite smile that arrived a moment too late. Vanessa greeted Naomi with perfect professionalism, but there was a flicker in her eyes that Naomi could not immediately define. That was the first crack in the life Naomi believed she understood. Over the following weeks, those cracks quietly widened. Vanessa began appearing at more executive meetings. Ethan praised her insights during board discussions. Investors who once addressed Naomi first gradually turned their attention toward the elegant new operations coordinator who seemed to be everywhere Ethan was. Naomi did not confront Ethan immediately. She watched. She listened. She gathered facts the same way she would approach any legal investigation. What she discovered over the next few months would slowly unravel everything she once trusted. And far away in the present, as the Rolls-Royce moved deeper into Manhattan traffic, Naomi Carter looked up at the towering Whitmore Global headquarters rising above Park Avenue and understood that the first thread of betrayal had begun in that quiet office conversation years ago. The Rolls-Royce slowed as it turned onto Park Avenue, the towering glass building of Whitmore Global rising ahead like a monument to everything Naomi Carter once helped create. She studied the reflection of the building across the polished marble of the neighboring towers and felt a quiet stillness settle inside her chest. 5 years ago, she had walked through those doors every morning with confidence, greeted by employees who trusted her judgment and executives who relied on her clarity in moments of risk. That world had not collapsed overnight. It had unraveled slowly, thread by thread, while she was still trying to understand what was happening. The first signs were subtle. Vanessa Hale began appearing in strategic meetings that normally required only senior executives. Ethan praised her instincts during presentations and frequently asked for her opinion before anyone else spoke. Investors who once addressed Naomi as the legal authority of Whitmore Global gradually shifted their attention toward Vanessa, who always seemed perfectly prepared with numbers, forecasts, and confident recommendations. At first, Naomi told herself it was simply business growth. Companies evolved, new voices emerged, and talented people earned influence quickly. But something beneath the surface felt different. Vanessa's rise was not gradual. It was precise, calculated. One evening, Naomi stayed late reviewing compliance reports when an unusual financial transfer appeared on her screen. It was small enough to avoid immediate attention, but structured in a way that raised questions. The funds had moved through a subsidiary account that rarely handled executive transactions. Naomi followed the trail through several internal systems, her legal instincts sharpening with each detail she uncovered. The transaction had been authorized through Ethan's executive clearance, but the documentation had been submitted under Vanessa Hale's internal identification credentials. Naomi leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen while the quiet hum of the office filled the empty hallway. Whitmore Global operated under strict financial oversight. Every transfer above $50,000 required layered authorization and complete transparency. This transfer had been carefully disguised within operational adjustments that most analysts would overlook. Naomi printed the records and slipped them into a folder without saying a word. Over the next 2 weeks, she quietly monitored the company accounts. The pattern repeated. Each transfer was slightly larger than the last. Each one moved through complex channels designed to appear routine. and each one passed through Vanessa's internal access system. Naomi did not confront Ethan immediately. She knew him too well. If there was an explanation, he would offer it before she even finished the question. Instead, she continued gathering information, mapping the transfers across multiple subsidiaries and reviewing every authorization connected to Vanessa's growing authority inside the company. What she discovered made the pattern impossible to ignore. Millions of dollars had begun quietly moving through financial structures that only two people inside Whitmore Global had the authority to approve: Ethan Whitmore and Naomi Carter herself. Yet Naomi had never signed those approvals. Late one night, she finally approached Ethan in his office, the city lights glowing beyond the glass walls behind him. He looked tired but composed, reviewing documents across his desk. Naomi placed the folder gently in front of him. Ethan glanced at the pages, then looked up at her with a calm expression that felt strangely distant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Naomi watched his face carefully, waiting for the man she once trusted to offer a reasonable explanation. Instead, Ethan closed the folder slowly and folded his hands together. "You should not be looking into these accounts," he said quietly. Naomi studied him in silence, the quiet certainty inside her beginning to shift into something colder. "I built the legal structure of this company," she replied evenly. "There is not a transaction in Whitmore Global that exists outside my responsibility." Ethan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, as if preparing for a conversation he had already rehearsed. "Things are changing, Naomi," he said. Naomi felt the final thread of doubt snap inside her mind. Because in that moment, she realized the financial mystery she had been investigating was not the real problem. The real problem was the man sitting across from her who no longer looked at her like a partner, but like an obstacle. Naomi Carter stood across from Ethan Whitmore's desk while the city lights shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass behind him. And in that quiet office, something inside their marriage finally shifted from doubt to clarity. Ethan's voice remained calm, almost rehearsed, but Naomi heard what was hidden beneath it. "Things are changing," he repeated as if the words themselves were meant to close the conversation. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him. She simply placed both hands lightly on the edge of the desk and looked directly into the eyes of the man she once trusted more than anyone in the world. "Millions of dollars are moving through accounts that require my authorization," she said quietly. "And I never signed those approvals." Ethan's expression barely changed. For several seconds he studied her as though measuring how much she truly understood. Finally, he pushed the folder back toward her across the desk. "You should let the finance department handle internal transactions," he replied. Naomi felt a faint chill settle beneath her calm exterior. Ethan Whitmore had built an empire through decisive clarity. He never avoided a financial discussion. He never dismissed a legal question. Yet now he was closing the conversation with the indifference of someone who had already decided the outcome. Naomi picked up the folder slowly. "Vanessa Hale submitted the authorizations," she continued evenly. "But the system shows they were approved under executive authority. That means you." Ethan stood and walked toward the window, his back now facing her. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with its usual evening energy, traffic lights glowing red and gold far below them. "Vanessa is handling several restructuring initiatives," he said without turning around. "You do not need to involve yourself in every operational detail." Naomi watched him carefully. For years, she had studied people across negotiation tables, learning how truth revealed itself through the smallest hesitation. Tonight, Ethan Whitmore did not hesitate. That certainty told her more than any explanation could. "Operational detail," Naomi repeated softly. "Is that what you call a pattern of financial transfers designed to disappear inside subsidiary accounts?" Ethan finally turned around. His expression remained composed, but something colder had replaced the warmth that once lived in his eyes. "You are overanalyzing routine adjustments," he said. Naomi closed the folder and held it calmly at her side. In that moment, she understood something that would change everything that followed. Ethan was not surprised by her discovery. He had expected it eventually, which meant the situation unfolding around her was not a mistake. It was a plan. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere inside Whitmore Global shifted in ways that became impossible to ignore. Board meetings were suddenly scheduled without Naomi's involvement. Vanessa Hale began presenting strategic proposals directly to investors. often seated beside Ethan as though her authority had always existed. Executives who once consulted Naomi before major decisions now seemed hesitant to approach her office at all. The final moment came during a quarterly board meeting when the company's chief financial officer announced a formal internal investigation. Millions of dollars had vanished through unauthorized transfers tied to executive-level access. Naomi sat perfectly still while the boardroom erupted with confusion. She watched Ethan Whitmore across the long conference table as the accusations unfolded. When the chief financial officer revealed that the digital authorization traced directly to Naomi Carter's executive credentials, the room fell silent. Naomi slowly turned her head toward Ethan, waiting for him to correct the mistake, waiting for him to speak the truth that would immediately end the investigation. Ethan Whitmore met her eyes for a long moment. Then he did something that shattered the last piece of the life Naomi believed she understood. He said nothing. Within hours, federal investigators arrived at Whitmore Global Headquarters. The same reporters who once photographed Naomi Carter as the brilliant legal mind behind one of Manhattan's most powerful companies now shouted questions as she was escorted out of the building she helped build. Cameras flashed. Headlines formed instantly. The story was perfect for public attention. A billionaire betrayed by his own wife. A powerful woman exposed by the company she helped create. Through the chaos, Naomi only looked at one person. Ethan Whitmore stood inside the glass entrance of the building beside Vanessa Hale, watching everything unfold with quiet composure. In that moment, Naomi Carter understood that the investigation, the accusations, and the evidence had never been an accident. They had been designed. The investigation moved quickly after that day, faster than Naomi Carter could have imagined possible, as if every step had already been carefully prepared long before the first accusation was spoken aloud in the Whitmore Global boardroom. Federal auditors reviewed transaction records while attorneys from some of the most powerful law firms in Manhattan filled the courtroom with quiet authority. Naomi sat beside her legal counsel during the early hearings, listening as financial charts and digital authorizations were presented as undeniable proof that millions of dollars had been transferred through her executive credentials. Each document appeared precise. Each record seemed complete, and every piece of evidence pointed directly toward her. Naomi watched the proceedings with the calm focus that once made her one of the most respected legal strategists in corporate America. She knew how investigations worked. She understood how evidence could be interpreted, how patterns could be shaped into narratives. That seemed impossible to challenge. Yet what unfolded inside that courtroom went far beyond professional strategy. It felt like a story that had already been written before she ever walked through the door. The most devastating moment came when Ethan Whitmore entered the courtroom as a witness. The same man who once introduced her proudly to investors now stood before the judge with a composed expression and answered each question with careful precision. When the prosecutor asked whether Naomi Carter had full access to the financial authorization system, Ethan confirmed it without hesitation. When the prosecutor asked whether he had ever suspected irregularities in her behavior, Ethan paused briefly before answering that recent months had revealed concerning changes in Naomi's conduct. The room remained silent while his words settled over the courtroom like a verdict already decided. Naomi did not interrupt. She did not argue. She simply watched him with the quiet clarity of someone who finally understood the depth of betrayal standing before her. Weeks later, the trial reached its conclusion. The prosecution presented a final summary of financial movements, digital signatures, and executive authority records that appeared impossible to dispute. Naomi's defense attorney argued that the digital system could have been manipulated, that internal access credentials could be replicated or reassigned. But the complexity of corporate finance worked against her. To the jury, the story seemed simple. A powerful executive with unlimited access had redirected company funds through a web of accounts. Even Naomi knew that without proof of manipulation, the legal structure surrounding those transactions would appear overwhelming. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom remained completely still. Naomi felt a strange calm settle over her as the judge spoke the words that would redefine the next chapter of her life. 5 years in federal prison for financial fraud and embezzlement. Cameras flashed again as reporters hurried outside the courthouse to deliver the story that would dominate the evening news. The brilliant corporate lawyer who built Whitmore Global had betrayed the very company she helped create. As Naomi was escorted from the courtroom, she turned her head slightly and saw Ethan Whitmore standing near the exit beside Vanessa Hale. Vanessa wore a tailored ivory suit and watched the scene with quiet composure, her expression almost sympathetic to anyone who did not know the truth. Ethan's gaze met Naomi's for only a moment. For years Naomi had memorized every expression that crossed his face, every subtle change in his voice during difficult negotiations. Now there was nothing left to read. His expression had become something distant, almost relieved. Outside the courthouse, the Manhattan skyline stretched across the horizon beneath a pale gray sky. Naomi Carter stepped into the waiting vehicle that would take her away from the city she once helped rule, and as the door closed behind her, she made a silent promise that no courtroom could hear. The story the world believed was not the story that would last forever. The first morning inside Bedford Hills Correctional Facility began long before the sun rose over the gray concrete walls. Naomi Carter woke to the quiet echo of footsteps in the hallway and the soft metallic click of doors unlocking one by one down the corridor. For a moment, she lay still on the narrow bed, staring at the pale ceiling above her, allowing the reality of where she was to settle fully into her mind. 5 years. The number no longer sounded like a sentence spoken in a courtroom. It now existed as a stretch of time she would have to live through one sunrise at a time. The cell was small but orderly. A metal bed, a thin mattress, a narrow shelf, and a single window positioned high in the wall that allowed a thin blade of morning light to enter the room. Naomi sat up slowly and placed her feet on the cold floor. 5 years earlier, she had woken each morning in a penthouse overlooking Central Park with sunlight reflecting across polished marble and the distant hum of Manhattan traffic far below. Now the world had been reduced to a quiet room no larger than a walk-in closet. Yet the strangest part was not the loss of luxury. It was the silence. No reporters shouting questions. No lawyers presenting arguments. No board members watching her every move. Only the quiet space between one thought and the next. Naomi had always believed that a clear mind was the most powerful tool a person could possess. Inside Whitmore Global, she built her reputation on that principle. When negotiations became chaotic, she remained calm. When investors panicked, she studied the numbers until the answer revealed itself. Now she applied that same discipline to survival. The first weeks passed slowly. Prison routines were strict but predictable. Breakfast arrived at 6 in the morning. Work assignments followed. Lights dimmed early in the evening. Many of the women around her carried stories filled with regret and frustration. Naomi listened more than she spoke. She observed the rhythms of the place, the unspoken rules, the quiet alliances that formed between people who had little else left to protect. One afternoon she discovered the prison library, a modest room lined with aging shelves of books that few inmates seemed to visit regularly. Naomi stepped inside and felt something familiar return to her for the first time since the trial. Purpose. She began reading every financial text she could find. Economic history, corporate law, investment strategy. At night she sat on the edge of her bed with a small notebook and wrote pages of analysis by hand, mapping the structure of Whitmore Global from memory. She traced every subsidiary, every account channel, every internal department she once supervised. She rebuilt the entire company in her mind piece by piece until the patterns she once knew began to appear again with sharp clarity. Weeks turned into months. The anger that might have consumed someone else slowly transformed into something far more controlled. Naomi was not interested in revenge. Revenge belonged to people who acted without strategy. What Naomi wanted was truth, and truth required patience. Nearly 8 months after her arrival, a visitor requested a meeting in the facility's small consultation room. Naomi walked inside and immediately recognized the man waiting at the table. Daniel Brooks stood as she entered, his calm expression unchanged from the last time she saw him in the courtroom hallway. "Hello, Naomi," he said quietly. She studied him for a moment before sitting down across from him. "I assumed you would eventually come," she replied. Daniel placed a thin folder on the table between them. "I never believed the case against you made sense," he said. Naomi looked at the folder, but did not open it yet. "Then you understand something very important," she said calmly. Daniel nodded once. Naomi Carter finally allowed herself the smallest trace of a smile as the afternoon light filtered through the narrow window behind him. Because in that moment, She knew the most important thing about the future had just changed. She was no longer investigating the truth alone. The small consultation room inside Bedford Hills Correctional Facility was quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights above the metal table where Naomi Carter and Daniel Brooks now sat facing each other. Naomi had imagined this moment many times during the long months she spent studying the past inside the prison library, but she did not rush to open the folder Daniel placed in front of her. Instead, she studied him carefully, the same way she once studied witnesses across negotiation tables when the truth mattered more than appearances. Daniel Brooks had been one of the few attorneys in Manhattan known for questioning financial prosecutions that seemed too perfect. His reputation was built on patience and precision, two qualities Naomi understood well. "Tell me what made you look deeper," Naomi said calmly. Daniel rested his hands on the table and spoke with quiet certainty. "Because the evidence against you was flawless," he replied. Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly, recognizing the implication immediately. Evidence that appeared flawless often meant it had been designed that way. Daniel slid the folder toward her. Naomi opened it slowly and began scanning the documents inside. Transaction records, authorization logs, internal security access reports. At first glance, the pages looked almost identical to the materials presented during her trial. But then Naomi noticed something the prosecution never mentioned: timestamps. The digital signatures attached to several financial transfers had been recorded during hours when Naomi was physically present in board meetings or investor conferences. The internal system should have logged the device location connected to those approvals. Yet the records simply listed executive authorization without identifying the terminal used. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair and allowed the information to settle in her mind. "Someone replicated my credentials," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "That was my conclusion as well." Naomi turned another page. Additional financial trails appeared beneath the first set of transfers, moving through a chain of subsidiary accounts connected to external shell corporations. It was complex but not invisible. The pattern had simply been buried beneath layers of legitimate transactions until the trail disappeared entirely. Naomi's voice remained steady. "The company servers record every internal login attempt," she said. "Even failed attempts." Daniel allowed a small smile. "Exactly. And that is where things become interesting." He pointed to a highlighted line in the report. The internal system logs revealed repeated access attempts connected to a senior operations terminal during the weeks leading up to the investigation. The terminal assigned to Vanessa Hale. Naomi closed the folder slowly and folded her hands together on the table. The quiet room suddenly felt smaller, not because the truth frightened her, but because it confirmed what she had already suspected during the final days before her arrest. Vanessa had not simply appeared inside Whitmore Global by coincidence. She had been placed there deliberately. "Does Ethan know you have this?" Naomi asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first." Naomi stood and walked slowly to the narrow window set high in the wall. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass in thin, pale lines across the floor. 5 years earlier, she would have confronted Ethan immediately with evidence like this. She would have demanded answers. But prison had changed something fundamental in the way she understood power. Truth was not effective unless it appeared at the exact moment when no one could ignore it. Naomi turned back toward the table, her expression calm but focused. "The Whitmore Global Annual Gala is tonight," she said quietly. Daniel looked surprised. "You already know." Naomi gave a faint smile. "Ethan always schedules it the first Friday in October." Daniel studied her carefully. "You intend to confront them?" Naomi shook her head slowly. "No," she replied. "Confrontation is emotional. This requires strategy." She walked back to the table and placed one hand lightly on the folder. "The truth will reveal itself when the entire world is watching." Daniel's expression shifted as he realized what she was planning. Naomi Carter had spent 5 years in silence preparing for the moment when the story that destroyed her would finally collapse under its own weight. And now that moment was closer than anyone inside Whitmore Global could possibly imagine. The afternoon light inside the consultation room faded slowly as Naomi Carter and Daniel Brooks finished reviewing the final pages of evidence spread across the metal table. Naomi closed the folder carefully, her movements calm and precise, but Daniel could see the quiet intensity behind her composure. 5 years earlier, she had walked into a courtroom surrounded by accusations she could not immediately disprove. Now the same pattern of financial manipulation that destroyed her life had finally revealed its hidden structure. Vanessa was careful, Daniel said as he gathered several of the documents. Most people would never have noticed these. Access records. Naomi nodded slightly. Vanessa understood the system because she studied it from the inside, she replied. But she made one mistake. She assumed I would never return to examine it. Daniel watched her thoughtfully. And Ethan? He asked. Naomi remained silent for a moment before answering. Ethan believed the evidence was strong enough that no one would question it again, she said quietly. The weight of that truth did not anger her anymore. Prison had taken away many things from Naomi Carter, but it had also removed the illusion that powerful people always deserved loyalty. She no longer viewed Ethan Whitmore as the man she married. He had become a decision, and decisions had consequences. As the prison guard signaled that visiting hours were ending, Daniel placed the documents back into the folder and slid it toward Naomi. Your release is scheduled for tomorrow morning, he said. Naomi nodded once. 5 years, she said softly. Long enough for people to believe the story is finished. Daniel stood, adjusting his coat as he prepared to leave. The Whitmore Global Annual Gala begins at 7 o'clock tonight, he reminded her. Naomi allowed the faintest smile to return. I remember, she said. Ethan always liked dramatic timing. The guard opened the door, and Daniel stepped into the hallway, pausing briefly before turning back toward her. Naomi, he said quietly, once you walk into that room, everything changes. Naomi looked up at him with steady confidence. Everything already changed 5 years ago, she replied. Tonight the world simply catches up. The following morning, the iron gates of Bedford Hills Correctional Facility opened as the sun rose across the quiet New York countryside. Naomi Carter stepped outside carrying nothing but a small bag containing the few personal items she had kept through the years. Waiting near the entrance was the same black Rolls-Royce that had brought her to Manhattan once before. Daniel Brooks stood beside the car, holding the door open as she approached. Ready? He asked. Naomi glanced back at the prison walls one last time. They no longer represented defeat. They represented preparation. More than ready, she answered calmly. The car began its quiet drive toward Manhattan, moving through winding highways and early morning traffic until the familiar skyline appeared once again against the horizon. By late afternoon, the Rolls-Royce stopped outside an elegant townhouse on the Upper East Side. Inside, Naomi prepared for the evening with the same controlled precision that once defined her professional life. The dress waiting for her was deep crimson silk, elegant and simple, chosen not for attention but for symbolism. When she stepped in front of the mirror, she did not see the woman who once stood beside Ethan Whitmore as his loyal partner. She saw someone stronger, someone who had survived the collapse of everything she built and returned with clarity no courtroom could silence. As evening lights began to glow across Manhattan, the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel filled with executives, investors, and journalists attending the most anticipated financial gala of the year. Ethan Whitmore stood near the center of the room, speaking confidently with board members, while Vanessa Hale greeted guests with polished charm beside him. Neither of them noticed the quiet black car stopping outside the hotel entrance. Moments later, the ballroom doors opened, and Naomi Carter walked in. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as the Whitmore Global Annual Gala reached its height. The air filled with quiet conversations, polished laughter, and the soft music of a string quartet playing near the marble staircase. Manhattan's most powerful investors and executives filled the room in tailored suits and elegant gowns, all gathered to celebrate another year of success for one of the city's most influential financial empires. At the center of the room, Ethan Whitmore stood confidently among board members and international partners, speaking with the calm authority that had built his reputation across the financial world. His voice carried easily through the surrounding circle of guests as he described Whitmore Global's newest investment expansion, each word reinforcing the image of a leader who had weathered every challenge placed before him. Beside him, Vanessa Hale moved gracefully between conversations, greeting guests with polished charm and the quiet confidence of someone who had risen quickly through the ranks of the company. In the years since Naomi Carter's conviction, Vanessa had become a familiar face in the world of finance, praised for her strategic insight and often described in business magazines as the brilliant executive who helped guide Whitmore Global through its most difficult chapter. For many in the room, the scandal of 5 years earlier had faded into distant memory, replaced by the narrative that Ethan Whitmore had saved his company from betrayal through decisive leadership. The ballroom doors opened quietly near the entrance as another guest arrived, but at first no one noticed. The sound of heels crossing the polished marble floor was soft beneath the music, measured and unhurried. Naomi Carter stepped into the light of the chandeliers wearing a deep crimson dress that moved gently with each step, her presence calm, yet unmistakable. For a moment the room continued as it had before, conversations flowing easily, while servers carried glasses of champagne through the crowd. Then someone near the entrance recognized her. A whisper moved across the nearest group of guests like a sudden shift in the air. Heads turned slowly. One conversation stopped, then another. The ripple of quiet recognition spread across the ballroom until the music itself seemed to fade behind the growing silence. Naomi continued walking forward without hesitation, her posture steady and composed, her gaze directed toward the center of the room, where Ethan Whitmore stood speaking with several investors. Daniel Brooks entered a few steps behind her, his expression calm as he observed the reaction unfolding around them. By the time Naomi reached the edge of the main gathering circle, nearly every guest in the ballroom had turned toward her. The story the world believed had returned unexpectedly to the room where its final chapter was supposed to remain closed forever. Ethan Whitmore noticed the shift in attention before he saw the cause. Conversations around him had stopped, replaced by a quiet tension that felt unfamiliar in a room usually filled with admiration. He followed the direction of the crowd's gaze, and his expression changed in a way no one had seen before. Naomi Carter stood only a few yards away beneath the crystal lights, calm and composed as though the past 5 years had been nothing more than a distant memory. Vanessa Hale turned as well, her confident smile freezing the instant she recognized the woman standing across the ballroom. For several long seconds no one spoke. Naomi looked at Ethan with the quiet clarity of someone who had spent 5 years preparing for exactly this moment. The silence in the ballroom became complete as she stepped forward into the center of the room, the crimson silk of her dress catching the light as she stopped directly across from him. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but strong enough to carry through the stunned crowd. "Good evening, Ethan," Naomi Carter said. "Did you miss me?" For several seconds after Naomi Carter's words echoed across the ballroom, the entire room remained frozen in stunned silence. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above the gathering of Manhattan's most powerful investors and executives. Yet no one spoke, no one moved, as if the air itself had suddenly grown heavier. Ethan Whitmore stood perfectly still at the center of the room, his confident posture slowly tightening as the reality of the moment settled over him. 5 years earlier, he had watched Naomi Carter disappear from the public world, surrounded by accusations that seemed impossible to challenge. The story had ended neatly then, or at least that was what everyone believed. Now the woman who had once shared his empire stood only a few feet away beneath the same lights that once celebrated their success together. Naomi did not rush the moment. She simply watched Ethan with the calm patience of someone who had spent 5 years learning that truth does not need to shout in order to be heard. Around them the guests began exchanging uneasy glances. Several reporters attending the gala quietly reached for their phones. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was charged with curiosity. Vanessa Hale was the first to recover her voice. She stepped forward slightly, her elegant composure returning as she addressed Naomi with polite restraint. "This event is private," Vanessa said carefully. "You are not on the guest list." Naomi turned her head slightly toward her, studying the woman whose quiet ambition had once moved unnoticed through the halls of Whitmore Global. For a brief moment Naomi's expression softened into something almost thoughtful. "You are correct," Naomi replied calmly. 5 years ago I stopped receiving invitations." A faint ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the crowd before fading again into silence. Ethan finally spoke, his voice measured but tense beneath its surface control. "Naomi," he said slowly, "this is neither the time nor the place for this conversation." Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Actually," she said quietly, "this is the perfect place." Daniel Brooks stepped forward beside her, holding the thin folder that had traveled with them from the prison consultation room to the center of Manhattan's most exclusive gathering. The movement drew the attention of several board members who recognized him immediately. Daniel Brooks was known throughout the financial world for dismantling complex fraud cases that others believed were untouchable. Naomi continued speaking with the same steady calm. 5 years ago the world was told a story, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. A story about betrayal, missing money, and a brilliant company saved by a courageous leader. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt. Naomi gestured gently toward the guests surrounding them. Many of you believe that story, she continued. And honestly, I cannot blame you. The evidence was impressive. Daniel opened the folder and removed several printed documents, handing copies to the nearest board members who instinctively leaned forward to examine them. The shift in the room was immediate. Confusion replaced curiosity as the executives studied the detailed access logs and digital authorization reports printed across the pages. Naomi watched their reactions carefully before speaking again. What the court never examined closely were the system access records connected to those transactions, she explained calmly. Every financial authorization inside Whitmore Global is tied to a specific device and location. Several board members exchanged quick looks as they began reading the highlighted entries. Daniel spoke next, his voice firm but professional. These records were recently recovered from archived internal security logs, he said. They show repeated login attempts and authorization entries connected to a terminal assigned to Vanessa Hale. The silence that followed felt heavier than the one before Naomi entered the ballroom. Vanessa's composure faltered for the first time, her confident expression tightening as she realized the direction of the conversation unfolding in front of the entire financial community. Naomi's voice remained calm as she looked directly at Ethan Whitmore. You once told the world that the truth mattered more than anything, she said quietly. Tonight we finally agree. The silence inside the Plaza Ballroom thickened as the executives studied the documents, now passing from hand to hand. Naomi Carter watched their expressions carefully, recognizing the precise moment when confusion began transforming into realization. Board members who had once voted to remove her from the company now read the same digital records that the courtroom never examined closely enough. One by one their eyes moved across the highlighted timestamps, the device identification codes, and the login attempts connected to a terminal registered under Vanessa Hale's internal credentials. A quiet murmur began spreading through the room as investors exchanged uneasy looks. Daniel Brooks remained calm beside Naomi, allowing the evidence to speak before adding his voice. These system logs were archived automatically by Whitmore Global's internal security network, he explained clearly. They were never submitted during the original investigation. One of the senior board members lifted his head slowly, his voice strained with disbelief. These records show repeated access attempts from Vanessa Hale's terminal during the same hours the financial transfers were authorized under Naomi Carter's credentials. Daniel nodded. Exactly. The room grew even quieter. Vanessa Hale's confident composure had begun to fracture as the realization spread among the people surrounding her. She forced a calm smile and stepped forward slightly, her voice controlled but sharp beneath its polished tone. Internal access logs can be misinterpreted, she said. Anyone familiar with corporate systems understands that. Naomi turned toward her slowly, her expression neither angry nor triumphant. That would be true, Naomi replied calmly, if the system did not also record device location and repeated authorization attempts. Daniel removed another document from the folder and handed it to the nearest executive. This record shows that several failed login attempts occurred before the successful authorization was recorded, he said, all from the same terminal. The executive read the page again, his face tightening. Vanessa's terminal. A ripple of tension moved through the room as more guests began examining the evidence. Vanessa's voice rose slightly. This proves nothing, she said. Someone could have used my terminal. Naomi allowed a small pause before responding, giving the crowd time to absorb the unfolding truth. That possibility was considered, she said quietly, which is why the system also recorded the biometric login verification used that evening. Vanessa's expression finally faltered. Daniel spoke again with measured precision. The biometric record confirms the authorization attempt was made by Vanessa Hale. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before. Across the room, several journalists who had been invited to cover the gala began recording the conversation unfolding in front of them. The story that once destroyed Naomi Carter was now collapsing under the weight of its own missing details. Ethan Whitmore had remained motionless throughout the exchange, but the tension in his posture was no longer hidden. Naomi turned her gaze toward him, her voice softer now but impossible to ignore. 5 years ago you told the world you chose integrity over loyalty, she said calmly. You said exposing the truth was the only way to save the company. Ethan's eyes met hers, and for the first time the confidence that defined him seemed uncertain. Naomi continued without raising her voice. The problem with lies is that they require perfect timing to survive. She gestured gently toward the documents, now circulating among the executives and investors who had once applauded Ethan Whitmore's leadership. And tonight the timing finally belongs to the truth. Around them the room no longer resembled a celebration. Conversations erupted in low, urgent voices as board members questioned one another and financial partners stepped aside to study the evidence more carefully. Vanessa Hale stood frozen near the center of the gathering, her earlier confidence gone as the consequences of the truth began closing around her. Naomi Carter simply stood beneath the chandeliers with quiet composure, watching the empire that once condemned her begin to confront the reality it had tried to bury. The ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. Conversations that once carried polite laughter had turned into low, urgent discussions as executives and investors studied the documents now circulating through the crowd. The truth that had remained buried for 5 years was unfolding in real time beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel. Naomi Carter stood quietly at the center of the room, her posture calm, her expression steady as she watched the reaction ripple outward through the people who once accepted the story of her downfall without question. One of the senior board members finally stepped forward, holding the printed system logs in his hand. His voice carried across the room with a seriousness that commanded attention. These records confirm the authorization trail never originated from Naomi Carter's device, he said slowly. The biometric login shows Vanessa Hale accessed the terminal at the time the transfers were executed. A wave of murmurs swept through the guests again, louder now, less restrained. Investors who once praised Ethan Whitmore's decisive leadership now exchanged cautious looks as they reconsidered everything they believed about the company's past. Vanessa Hale remained frozen near the center of the crowd, the composure that once defined her public presence completely gone. Her eyes moved quickly from the documents to Ethan Whitmore, silently searching for support that no longer appeared certain. Daniel Brooks spoke calmly beside Naomi, his voice carrying the clarity of a lawyer who had waited patiently for this moment. The financial trail continues. Through several shell corporations linked to accounts Vanessa Hale controlled during her time at Whitmore Global, he explained. Those transfers match exactly with the funds Naomi Carter was accused of misappropriating. The effect on the room was immediate. Board members began speaking over one another, investors stepped aside to make phone calls, and journalists who had been quietly observing the gala now moved closer with their recording devices raised. The carefully preserved reputation of Whitmore Global was beginning to fracture under the weight of the truth revealed in front of them. Through all of it, Naomi remained silent, watching the unfolding scene with the calm patience she had learned during 5 years of quiet preparation. Finally, Ethan Whitmore spoke, his voice controlled but no longer confident. This is not the place for accusations, he said. Naomi turned toward him slowly. The room fell silent again as she met his gaze. 5 years ago you said the exact same thing, she replied gently. Right before I was taken away. Ethan looked around the ballroom where the leaders of the financial world now studied him with growing skepticism. The authority he once commanded in this room had begun slipping away. Naomi continued speaking, her voice steady and composed. You built an empire by convincing people that your judgment could always be trusted, she said. Tonight they are finally seeing the difference between power and truth. Ethan's silence answered more clearly than any explanation he could offer. Across the room, Vanessa Hale lowered her gaze as security representatives quietly approached the gathering after being alerted by several board members reviewing the evidence. Naomi did not watch them. She had already finished the purpose that brought her here. Daniel stepped beside her again, his expression calm. The board will initiate a full review, he said quietly. Naomi nodded once. The outcome was no longer hers to control. The truth had already begun doing its work. She looked around the ballroom one last time, remembering a different night many years earlier when she and Ethan stood together beneath these same lights, celebrating the future they believed they were building side by side. That life no longer existed, and for the first time in years she did not miss it. Without another word, Naomi Carter turned and walked toward the ballroom doors. The crowd parted quietly as she passed, not with judgment this time, but with the quiet respect reserved for someone who had endured the collapse of everything and returned stronger than before. Outside the Plaza Hotel, the night air of Manhattan felt clear and open beneath the city lights. Daniel followed a few steps behind her as they reached the waiting car. "What happens now?" he asked. Naomi paused for a moment before answering. "Now," she said softly, looking up at the skyline she once ruled beside a man who chose betrayal over truth. "I finally get to build something that belongs to me." And with that, Naomi Carter stepped into the car and left the past behind her, while the empire that once destroyed her began quietly falling apart.